Daniel chapter 4 this morning is where we will begin, or continue on, I guess. Daniel is a fascinating book. I know I've sure had fun learning what it has, just as I teach you guys. I think I told someone last week that in reality I'm kind of exploiting everyone here, and I appreciate your allowing me to use you that way, to give me motivation to dig in and learn more than I normally otherwise would. The teacher always learns more than you guys, and I enjoy going through this book. This week we're picking up, as I said, in Daniel chapter 4, dreaming of trees. Sometimes I wonder what Nebuchadnezzar's special dreams were like. How did he know they were special? I mean, we all dream every night, right? Whether we remember our dreams or not. Even last night, I know I dreamed. I don't remember what it was right now, and you'd probably be bored with it anyway. Usually I'm just running around trying to accomplish things, and it's busy, and that's just kind of how my dreams go usually. But something about these dreams he knew was special. He knew they were urgent and important, and they needed to be solved. And so he calls in all of his wise men to have these solved. And I don't know what was special about these dreams, that he knew these were something different, but they were. Chapter 4, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and the wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. This does not sound like the introduction of a proclamation that a pagan foreign king would be making. I mean, this sounds like, quite honestly, the proclamation that an Israeli or a Judah king should be making, which, by the way, they tended not to do, which is why they were exiled in the first place. But this doesn't sound like the proclamation of a pagan foreign king. It starts out really like this, right? I mean, this is kind of why he's saying, "Hear ye, hear ye." Daniel chapter 5 takes the form of a royal proclamation from Nebuchadnezzar to all the subject of his empire. It is his announcement to his kingdom about the greatness of God that has just humbled him in the most extreme way. Chapter 5, really, as you read through it, it is a letter or a proclamation, a declaration to his people. And you can see in the verses I just read to you, he starts it out, he addresses what we call Daniel chapter 4, to all the subject of his kingdom. He says, I want to get this out to everyone. I want everyone in my kingdom to know this and understand what I'm about to tell you. And he starts it out by praising the God of Daniel, the God of Israel, to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. He is the ruler, he's in charge, he calls the shot throughout all the ages. Keep in mind, this is the same Nebuchadnezzar that we've dealt with for the last, really, 3 weeks, right? The same guy who had the dream of the statue, and he was all excited that he was the head of gold, right, because it's his kingdom. And he realizes, wow, this God of Israel, he's really smart. He can interpret dreams, right? This God of Israel, he is the God of the mysteries. He's the brainy God. He has the insights. And then last week, we talked about the fiery furnace. And again, Nebuchadnezzar had built a huge, tall display, a huge, tall memorial shrine to whoever it was. The Bible doesn't say, it just says an image of gold. Again, whether it was specifically to himself or, as my opinion tends to lead, probably to one of his gods who represented the kingdom and represented his success. And he commands that everybody bows down to this God, this golden image that I have made and set up. And if you don't, you will be thrown into the fire furnace and cooked like, I don't know, like a piece of bacon in a microwave or whatever. Thrown in the furnace and you will be burned to death. And as you know the story from last week, 3 guys decided to defy the order. They say, we will not bow down to that thing because that thing doesn't deserve the credit for either who we are or who you are, and we're not going to bow down and worship him. Nebuchadnezzar says, fine, you're going in the furnace. So they throw him in the furnace. You know the story. They are unharmed. There's a 4th being in there, like a son of the gods is what Nebuchadnezzar says. God sent either his son, Jesus pre-incarnate, or an angel. Don't know for sure. I suspect the former. But they're walking around in there, and Nebuchadnezzar says, come out. And they come out, and they're completely unharmed. And the point of the story, the climax of the story, we said, was not when they walk out of the furnace triumphant, but it's in Nebuchadnezzar's response to what he sees, right? You remember what Nebuchadnezzar's response is? Wow, I can't believe your guys' God has the power over the fire as well. Your God isn't just the God of the insights and the brains. He's got the power and the might as well. He can protect you from the fire. And he says, anybody here, all of my leaders, all of my diplomats and ambassadors and leaders and governors and everybody, anybody that criticizes the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is going to get what? Ripped apart in pieces, and your house is going to be turned into a landfill if you insult this God. So this God is not only the God of brains and mysteries. Chapter 3 says he is the God of power as well. Then we get to chapter 4, and before we even know what happens in chapter 4, we see a very different Nebuchadnezzar, don't we? This Nebuchadnezzar opens straight up with verses 1 through 3 that I just read you, proclaiming God's power and his authority and his majesty and his rule and his dominion. He says he is the one in charge. He's the boss. He's the one you bow down to. This God that we learn about is chapter 4. He's the God of, well, let's read through the chapter and we'll see what we can fill in the blank with by the end, shall we? Chapter 4, pick it up again in verse 4, and we'll read through verse 18 right now. Here's the backstory to his proclamation in the first 3 verses. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation. By the way, pause just for a second, a curiosity sidetrack here. In the first dream, Nebuchadnezzar said, if you guys are authentic, you're going to what? Tell me the dream, and then tell me their interpretation so I know whether you guys are, telling me the truth or not. This time, he says, all right, I just got to get it out there. I'm going to tell you the dream, what it is straight up. What do you think the difference was? I mean, honestly, I have no idea. It's just a curiosity to me. But for whatever reason, in this dream, he said, I'm going to tell you the dream, then you give me the interpretation, kind of like a normal dream interpretation, whatever that means. He didn't make them give them the dream. Either by this time, which we think is probably later on in his rule. Most commentators I read say this was like at the very tail end of his rule, like the very end. After he comes back, he doesn't rule a whole lot longer anyway. I'm not so sure. We'll get to that later. But it's much later. It's towards the end of his reign. Maybe he's just kind of losing his fire and his pep. He says, all right, I'm done messing around. Just tell me what it means and let's get on with it. I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that he revealed the dream to his people. Continuing on. Verse 7, the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers came in. I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation. At least they were honest, right? They didn't make something up. That's good. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and in whom the spirit of the holy is in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the visions of the dream that I saw and their interpretation. Again, I have to wonder, if he's the chief of all these guys, of all the advisors, why was he the last one to be brought in? Once again, we see everybody else comes in, and Daniel seems to be conspicuously absent. Then after all of them fail, finally Nebuchadnezzar calls Daniel in and says, all right, Daniel, I guess I got to call you in again, but I know you can give me the answer I need, but for some reason I didn't call you in at first. I don't understand why. Again, I don't really have an answer. We can speculate, but I think it's fascinating to me. Continuing on in verse 10. The visions I saw of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to the heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heaven lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. And I saw in the vision of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher a Holy One, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, "Chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts of the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he will, and sets it over the lowliest of men. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw. And you, O Belteshazzar," that's Daniel, "tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation. But you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you." So Nebuchadnezzar calls Daniel in and he relays this dream. It's a huge, huge tree. Apparently a fruit tree. It talks about fruit and provision for everybody. The birds lived in the nest. The beasts, the animals ate off the fruit. Everybody is living off this tree and provides their shelter and their safety and their sustenance and their food from this tree. This tree provides for everybody. And while he's looking at this tree, this magnificent, strong, healthy, green, vibrant, productive tree, somebody comes down, somebody from heaven, and says, "Chop this thing down. Rip off its branches, scatter its leaves, destroy the tree, leave nothing left, except for the stump, which is in the ground." And we're not just going to ignore the stump. We're going to make sure that while we destroy the whole rest of the tree, the stump stays secure, and we're going to wrap it in bands of iron and brass. Again, in real life, not that that would actually protect a stump. We know it's still rot, but I think symbolically in the dream, he's saying, keep this thing safe. This part stays safe and secure. We're not letting that be destroyed. It's going to stay wrapped up in bands of iron and brass. It says, and then all of a sudden at that point, it stops talking about the tree almost, doesn't it? It starts talking about it, the tree, and it starts talking about what? Look in your passage. In verse 16 for sure. Actually, in part of 15, it kind of fuses over. Leave the stump, bound in iron and brass, amid the tender grass of the field. Then let what? What's the word? The word him. All of a sudden, we're not talking about a tree. Now we're talking about a him. Fascinating how the pronouns shift over all of a sudden. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts of the grass of the field. Let his mind be changed from a man's. Let a beast's mind be given to him. Let 7 periods of time pass over him. And all of a sudden, it becomes pretty obvious that we're not talking about a tree here anymore. We're talking about something, or more specifically, somebody else. And whatever the tree had to do with anything, now we've shifted our focus to the him, whoever this is. Continuing in verse 17, to the end, or for the purpose, that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets it over the lowliest of men. And that's the end of the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar stops and he turns to Daniel and says, "This dream I, Nebuchadnezzar, saw, and you, Belteshazzar, tell me the interpretation, and I know you can." Well, continue in verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. It's almost like he stopped and paused, and I'm not sure if he was waiting for the interpretation or, as my guess, he was trying to decide how to deliver the interpretation to all-powerful King Nebuchadnezzar, because he knows this will not be pleasant. And you never know. King Nebuchadnezzar is a pretty powerful guy, right? And he can do what he wants, and he has done what he wanted. He's killed a lot of people. He's taken them out. He destroys people. That's what he can do. He's the ultimate authority, and he knows it. So Daniel's standing there, and he says, I'm going to give him this dream, which is not real favorable to him. What do I do? For a while, his thoughts alarmed. Verse 19, the king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation harm you. He's probably glad to hear that. Belteshazzar answered and said, My Lord, may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies. That's probably a good introduction. Daniel is not a dumb guy. He knows how to soften the blow a little bit. It says, King, I kind of wish I didn't have to tell you this. I wish I could deliver this dream to your enemies, because I wish you nothing but the best and success, O King Nebuchadnezzar. But here's what I have for you. Right? I wish this was for somebody else, he says. Verse 20. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to the heaven, and it was visible to the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which food was for all, under which the beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of the heaven lived. It is you, O King, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reached to the heavens, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And so far Nebuchadnezzar says, yay, that's not so bad, is it? Yeah, that's me. I provide for everybody. Everybody relies on me. So far, so good. No worries. Verse 23. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, come down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time, we believe to be years, will be passed over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will. And was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree. Your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. King, here's the dream, right? And here's what you saw. Here's the big tree. That's you. But it says, here's what's going to happen to you. And he lays it out. He says, again, back in verse 23, let him be wet with the dew of heaven, his portion be the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. Yeah. 24. Decree the Most High. This is what the Most High, the ruler of everything, says. You'll be driven away from people. Your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field. You'll eat grass like an ox. You'll be wet with the dew of heaven for 7 years, until you know who rules. That must have been a shocking situation for the kingdom. And I guess we can talk about this a little bit more in the next few verses, but again, nothing happens in a vacuum, right? We read these Bible stories and we see the main events that the writer gives us, that Daniel gives us, and we understand the events because they're kind of distilled and isolated out of everything. But again, put yourself in the place of the people back then. Let's say of his inner cabinet and of those of his castle and those who work with him on a daily basis. And you come in one day and there's the king, and he's doing what? He's on the ground kind of mooing. And you kind of walk up to him and approach him very carefully, because if the king wants to moo, the king can moo, right? I mean, he's the king, and who am I to say the king can't moo and crawl around on the ground, right? And they call an emergency cabinet meeting and say, I'm not sure, should we ask the king about this, or should we assume this is another one of his kingly duties that he thinks he's supposed to do? I don't know, but I certainly don't want to be the guy walking up and saying, hey, king, why are you mooing today? But they eventually realize this guy's gone completely wonky, and they drive him out. It says he's driven from among men. We can't deal with you anymore. And they send him out, and he's living outside. And again, I'm not sure where they put him. Do you put him in the royal pasture with all the other horses? Or, is there like a special kingly pasture courtyard in the middle of the castle somewhere that you put a king that moves? I'm not really sure what to do. This is kind of uncharted territory. But they have to decide what to do with this king who's completely lost his mind. And he's crawling around like an ox. He's eating grass. Kind of weird. Again, I thought it slightly ironic that you remember in chapter 1, you remember how Daniel decided to define himself as being different from the king of Babylon. He says, I will refuse to eat your what? Your kingly food. I will not allow you to define my success and take credit for it. And now by chapter 4, who is no longer eating the kingly food and who is going for a diet of vegetables and water? Only Nebuchadnezzar's choice of vegetables is slightly lower grade than what Daniel's was. Right now the king is also not eating the kingly food. And the king is now learning to submit to the Most High, kind of the way that Daniel had already learned back in chapter 1. Now, I don't know if we're supposed to draw a comparison between the two or not, but I thought it kind of fascinating that the king who is so proud of his kingly diet is now crawling around on the ground eating grass for 7 years. Until what? This isn't an open-ended punishment. He said there's a close on this. Until what? Until you learn who's really in charge here, Nebuchadnezzar. Until you know that God is the ruler. God already gave me credit by choosing the vegetables over the kingly diet. Now you're going to do the same. I'm going to give you the vegetables until you realize and acknowledge that I'm the one who gives you the power and that I'm in charge. I wish it was for somebody else. Verse 28. Fast forward about a year. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence, and for the glory of my majesty? He's looking about, possibly again on top of his palace. And I'm no expert on Babylonian architecture or anything, but I did read a little bit in preparation for this. Nebuchadnezzar apparently he loved his architecture. He loved building magnificent ancient Babylon. Everybody's heard of the Hanging Gardens, right, that he built for his wife so she wouldn't miss her homeland. Magnificent castle with the vegetation and the beautiful gardens on the roof flowing down over the walls, almost like it was flowing down. Beautiful streets and canals throughout Babylon. I guess according to what I read, there was kind of a main street going through Babylon. And I forget how far it was, almost a mile, I guess it was, something like that. I could be off, sorry if I am. But he had his architects just line it with glazed brick with mosaic on either side, beautiful lions and picturesque things for all the length of this. So you walk down this corridor and you're surrounded by architectural beauty and art and magnificence and castles and buildings and structures. Beautiful and gorgeous city. An amazing feat of architecture. And he's standing up on this castle saying, not only have I celebrated military defeat, celebrated my defeat of my enemies, not my own defeat, I'm celebrating my own victory and the defeats of my enemies. I've taken over all of my region, all the way down to Egypt. He had some huge victories there. I rule this my entire empire. Everyone bows to me. I'm super powerful. I've created this beautiful city, not to mention all the other building projects throughout my empire. I'm really something else. I've accomplished a lot in my life. And this is why commentators tend to say that he's looking back over the span of his career, his reign. And they think this is more towards the end of his reign. Maybe yes, maybe no, I'm not sure. But at least we know he had time to accomplish a lot of things so that he can look back over his accomplishments and say, this is what I have done. Verse 31, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. And 7 periods of time will pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Until you know that it's God that actually puts people in charge, who sets them up and takes them down. He says, until you realize that I'm the one that put you up, I'm going to be the one to take you down. Immediately, verse 33, the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. I should have looked up and I didn't. How long does it take for your nails to grow so long that they eventually start curling around and becoming like claws or like talons. I remember reading once a long time ago, just a little clip of I think it was the Guinness World Record guy with the longest fingernails, and I forget what it was, but I think it was a Hindu guy or whatever who was doing this as a measure of devotion to his, part of his worship or whatever. But they just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew until they finally started curling around and he couldn't do anything. But he grew them for a long time, and I don't remember how long it was, but that's kind of how you picture Nebuchadnezzar. His fingernail, he's just totally unkept. No personal hygiene is kind of what it's saying here, right? There's no grooming going on. There's nothing to make him human anymore. He's just crawling around like an animal, eating the grass, living outside, not living inside, what with the dew. And again, you wonder, how does somebody who is the highest of the high, the smartest of the smart, the most brilliant person come to this? And it's exactly what was stated right here. It's because the Most High is the one who takes up and puts down, and the Most High decided it's time for him to come down. Again, I don't know if we're supposed to draw a comparison or parallel here. We mentioned a couple weeks ago in Jeremiah 27:6 and 28:14, and again in Daniel chapter 2, verse 38, 3 separate times in 3 separate passages. It mentions how Nebuchadnezzar is given dominion not over only the peoples and nations of the earth, but also over do you remember what we said? The beasts of the field. All the beasts were subordinate to him as well. And again, some commentators say, well, it's just kind of a poetic way of saying he rules everything and everybody, right? He's in charge of everything. And I say, maybe so, but I don't remember the Bible using that phraseology for other rulers. But here it specifically says he has been given dominion not only over people, but also over the animals. And again, I think it fascinating in chapter 4, the animals that he once had dominion over, now he has what? Become one of them. Almost in every way, every trademark signature thing that Nebuchadnezzar did so well, God is throwing back in his face and saying, you're not in charge of that anymore. You're not in charge of that anymore. And he's taken down to the lowest that he can possibly be. And the Nebuchadnezzar that was in charge of all the beasts, now he is a beast, crawling around on the ground in humiliation, chewing grass, and with no hygiene or no care, nothing to make him mentally human anymore. He's stripped of all that until he realizes that God is in charge. Again, you wonder what was going through the mind of his advisors and his cabinet. Verse 34, at the end of the days, that would be at the end of the period of this time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And just as quick as it left, it came back. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? And again, it makes you wonder, again, just as a sidetrack, but to put us back in the minds of the people, you know what happens when a powerful nation suddenly has a power vacuum in its leadership, right? You can see it throughout history. It always happens. The king dies, what happens? Either A, there's a successor pre-planned and ready to take charge, usually the king's son or something like that, or there's a power vacuum and a huge infighting struggle until somebody takes over and gains the power and reigns. For whatever reason here, and we can speculate, in Babylon, for 7 years the king was out of commission. He was not operating as a king. And yet, as soon as Nebuchadnezzar regains his mind after 7 long years, all of a sudden everybody comes back and says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're back. How about you start reigning again? What happened during those 7 years? Who ran the country? Maybe his panel of advisors, maybe it was Daniel himself, kind of operating under the king's name. We don't know for sure. But we do know in verse 36, at the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. And again, it's unheard of, and it's almost unimaginable to me that the greatest empire in the world at that time completely leaderless for 7 years, officially anyway. And after 7 years, the guy who's been mooing and eating grass is put back in charge again. But that's exactly what God said would happen. And he fulfilled his word just like he always does. However that played out, and I don't know how it played out, but for whatever reason they did. And when he came back to his mind, his cabinet, his advisors all came back to him and sought him out. Again, if I'm an advisor, I'm not seeking out the guy who's been eating grass and whose hair is matted down and who could really use a little manicure in a really bad way. But they came back to him and they put him back in charge, and he regained his kingdom. And still more greatness, it says, was added to him in 36. Whatever he had before, God even added more back onto him. And he closes his proclamation. Remember, this is what we're reading here is all proclamation to all the peoples of his kingdom. He tells this humiliating story of himself as a means of elevating the God who did it to him. And he closes with this, verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all of his works are right, and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. And boy, didn't he know that firsthand. And God humbled him in an amazing way. I like how verse 35 says it. We read it just a minute ago, the last phrase of that. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Nobody can even look at God, Nebuchadnezzar says, and say, why are you doing this? Nobody can hold God accountable. Nobody can second guess him. Nobody can stop his plans. He is sovereign. He does what he does. He puts people up. He takes people down. He is the sovereign in charge of everything. He is the ruler. And that's the lesson that God wanted to teach Nebuchadnezzar. So he comes back to his mind and finally says, yeah, the God of Israel, Yahweh, he is the sovereign. He does what is right, and no one can question him. And again, just compare the Nebuchadnezzar of the end of chapter 4 to the Nebuchadnezzar of chapters 1 and 2 and 3. And God has really been working on him for quite a while, demonstrating his power and his superiority over the greatest superpower on earth. We said that chapter 2, God is the God of mysteries. Chapter 3, God is the God of power. So what is God the God of in chapter 4? I think we see kind of a progression going on here. What would we say God is the God of in chapter 4? I think in the words of Nebuchadnezzar himself, we can pretty much say that in chapter 4, God is the God of, well, everything. I mean, he does what he wants. Who can stop him? Who can second guess God when he does something? When he makes a choice, if he decides to give success to a nation and a country, who can stop him? He did it to Babylon. He did it to countless others before and after. And when he decides to take down a person or a country, who can stop him? Who can tell him he's doing it wrong? Nobody. He is sovereign. He not only has the power, he has the authority and the right to do it because he is sovereign and in charge. And again, this is the pagan king of Babylon making this kind of decree, a decree that you don't even hear the kings of Israel making for the most part, ever since David and probably Solomon in at least part of his reign. And God dealt with him in an amazing way. So far, the book of Daniel has not really been about Daniel or his 3 friends or even about Nebuchadnezzar himself. It's really been about the God who is stronger than Babylon and who is still caring for his people like he said he would. We said before that we're going into this, what I would call the miracle section of Daniel. And God is not just telling stories for the fun of it, although they are super fun stories. What's the point of the stories, especially as you put them all together back to back? We see a recurring theme over and over and over. What is it? To the people of the empire, we're teaching them that what? God is, he is the God. I don't care about your local gods, and I don't care about the God of Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon. The God of Israel is the true God, and he's the one to be dealt with. He's the one to be followed and paid attention to. And for those who are Jewish exiles in Babylon throughout the empire, what's his message to them? Again, I've asked before, if you're the Jewish exile who's scattered about throughout the kingdom, and you start to hear these stories come in, and these decrees from Nebuchadnezzar himself saying, wow, the God of Israel, he's the real God. Forget my gods, forget my golden statue, forget my stuff. He's the real God to be dealt with. He's the one that calls the shots. What's your response? What do you think? What do you feel as you hear those stories? He's still with us here in exile, right? He's still keeping his promise to us. He said he would bring us back. He said that someday, after we were exiled, we'd be brought back into the land. I wonder if he's going to keep his promise. I wonder if he can actually do that kind of thing. I wonder if God is strong enough to take us out of Babylon. And the answer in chapter 4 is, yeah, I'm pretty sure he can. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he can. In fact, even Nebuchadnezzar himself says that he can if he wants to. So he can keep his promise to us, and he's still watching over us. And I wonder if part of him also didn't say, I wonder if maybe we should have paid a little bit more attention to our God when we were back in the land. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea for us to turn to Baal and to Molech and all those. I can't even remember their names anymore. It's been so long, but I guess they don't even matter now because those gods lost and they're long gone and forgotten, and they're turning to dust now. And now the god of Babylon, and they got their gods, but even Nebuchadnezzar's turning to our God and saying that our God's the best. Maybe he's the one we should start to follow. And as he finally keeps his promise after 70 years and brings us back into the land, probably he's the one we should worship then too. And God is displaying his power and showing who he is throughout these miracles in 2, 3, 4, and we'll see more in 5 and 6 as well as we continue. But for now, that's the end of chapter 4. Let's pray, and I'll actually be on time this week. Dear God, we thank you for this book, and we can go through. You show us your strength and your wisdom, your power. And this week, not only your power, but your authority and your sovereignty. Even if we could find another God of power like you, which we cannot, he wouldn't have the authority to do the things that you do. You are the creator. You're in charge of all things. You own all things. That's what you showed to Nebuchadnezzar. You had to humble him in an overwhelming way. I pray that you'd keep us humble as well. Hopefully, it won't take quite the extent that it did for Nebuchadnezzar. I hope you can be more gentle with us, and I hope that we would be more receptive to your authority. But help us remember who's in charge in our lives as well. And in this world that is crazy and chaotic, and we wonder who's really winning and who's in charge, we know that you can and will step in at any time you choose to direct things in the way that you want them to go. Thank you for that reassurance and for your sovereignty. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.